Hi, I'm Ralph Bloch, the creator of GString. In this presentation, we'll discuss how the program handles potential biases. Some biases the software will suspect, others you have to watch out for explicitly if they're inherent in the experimental design. The previous presentation focused on how to organize the scores of a simple objective performance test involving various facets. We look at the result of a simple true-false test evaluating a fictitious senior school in early 20th century Middle America. True-false tests represent the simplest form of objective performance tests where scores can be expressed as 0 or 1 values that can be added and for which an arithmetic means exists. Let us now progress. Unfortunately, the artist Robert Harris had died a few years before he could have painted this scene of a heated school board meeting. Mrs. Erudite, representing the faculty, reminded the board that there is more to education than just factual knowledge. She acknowledged that testing for more complex competencies is difficult and suggested that students be evaluated on a 1-hour essay with the topic, "If I were the mayor, what would I change and why?" The topic was chosen to match the experience of young Americans and encourage a wide scope of topics. Scoring was distributed across 6 essential text quality domains. Explicit quality criteria for each quality domain have yet to be established by a consensus process. A 4-point integer scale, that is 0 to 3, avoids an overly neutral position. Let's examine the process of measuring in more detail. A phenomenon, that is a thing or a performance, is compared to a defined standard in order to arrive at a numeric score within a defined scale as defined by Stanley Smith Stevens in 1946. Scores may be objective if simple absolute criteria can be defined in advance, or they may be subjective if qualified human judgment by a rater is required for scoring. Performance tests can only be analyzed statistically if it is possible to calculate means and variances. Only interval data types meet this criterion. Fortunately, binary, integer, and rational numbers can be expressed as interval types. Objective measures require absolute standards. Measurement standards have a long history from the Maître Étalon across from the Senate at the Palais du Luxembourg in Paris to official standard measures of volume for grain, rice, and beans on the market square in the little Swiss town of Gruyère, the home of the famous cheese. Measurement standards are necessary for society to function. Subjective measures, on the other hand, are based on the judgment of qualified human judges or raters, where complex performance or products have to be evaluated. But subjective measures can vary between raters. The deviations of such objective estimates are unavoidable and collectively labeled as biased. Many forms and sources of bias are recognized and discussed, but it is important to distinguish between subconscious deviation in judgment and outright falsifications or purposeful lies. In short, I would never accuse Fox News of biased reporting. In objective tests, the score is determined entirely and sometimes automatically by the subject's response to the item. Identical responses will always result in identical scores. In subjective tests, the score is additionally influenced by the rater and his interactions with the other facets. My mother, who passed her medical licensing exams in 1930s, was convinced that she could improve her grade point average by wearing a red dress to the Viva exams. Let's look at this more formally by returning to linear model statistics. Objective scores are influenced only by the effects of subject, i.e. competence, the test item, i.e. easiness, as well as their interaction. Subjective scores, in addition, are affected by the rater's attitude as well as its interactions with all the effects inherent in the objective score. Again, we perform generalizability analysis on the test results. It's important to order the facets correctly. The rater has the highest priority, followed by students, each on a separate line, and finally the 6 item scores on that line. Students are nested within rater, 1 for each school. There are 6 scores followed by their mean. The mean is here only for clarity purpose. It is not used by the program. No problem in deriving the variance components. And finally, the generalizability coefficients that look fantastic. 96% of the facet of differentiation variance is due to the differences between students. But things look different when we display the mean scores in a standard box plot. The Plato students did much better than the Lloyd Street students. That raises some questions. Was the education at Plato better than that at Lloyd Street? Are rich kids more gifted than poor kids? Or were the 2 raters motivated by different bias incentives? We can simply not tell from the available data. Actually, there are some hints in the ANOVA table. Look at the large variance component for the raters. And students are nested in rater, so that whole variance is divided between the 2 groups of students allocated to one rater or the other. The students don't really have to be all that different. Artificial differences between 2 groups can be introduced by systematic bias differences between raters. Random bias tends to get averaged out, systematic bias persists. We really have to consider, does it really matter? Are these score differences important? Not when they're only used to rank students within each group. But that is different when important decisions are made overall based on the scores, such as licensing, college admission, or scholarship. then one group gets advantaged over the other. That is unfair, and it becomes a human rights issue. It is the responsibility of the planners to ensure the fairness of score-dependent sanctions, but that requires additional data. One last piece of advice for high-stakes exam. Generalizability analysis sometimes can detect random bias, but it is blind to systemic bias inherent in the design. When defined groups of students appear to differ markedly in their scores, check for possible sources of bias, even if it requires additional investigations. G-String is an open source project. Users don't pay for using it. No academic or commercial institution stands behind it. It is entirely up to you, the collective users, to ensure its survival. Unless the user community gets engaged in using the G-String GitHub repository, G-String will gradually lose its functionality due to changes in the software ecosystem. Unreported errors can't be fixed, and nobody will look after required updates. Thank you for your interest.